Shalom. We are here to learn about the conquest and what Adonai was doing during this time period, how that has to do with us, and how it has shaped our history and what we can learn from it. There was a TV program that talked about Jews and how they lived in America before Christopher Columbus. This is something that's not correct because the Reformation didn't take place until 1492, and Columbus didn't arrive during the Reformation era. This happened later in the 1500s. So it's not accurate to say that these Jews fled the Spanish Inquisition and came to the Americas before Columbus, because that sort of persecution started later. So when we are looking at context, it's important to understand the historical context, right? Because someone can just come up and say anything, right? And a lot of people just believe it because it sounds right. Purposefully or impurposefully, people mix things up, mix up timelines, get false conclusions based on that, and especially about major historical events. And so we talked last time about the Reformation, the four reformists that were influential during that time, and what that meant about the Catholic Church, about what that looked like and how that shaped during that time period. So we're going to go in this class a little bit earlier in history to understand what came later, right? So the Counter-Reformation. So we're going to discuss a completely different perspective and point of view. It's not going to be something about politics. It's not going to be anything like that. They are important here, but it's something for another class. So what are we going to focus on if we're not going to focus on the political aspect? It's going to be on the aspect of the doctrine and the evangelistic aspect. And so that is where we will focus during this class. So we're going to study the religious expansion and the conquest that took place in the continents of Asia, Europe, and the Americas. So when people say conquest, they think of just America, right? Christopher Columbus, all these things. They were also major things, historical events that happened in Asia and Europe that are worth mentioning. So each region had a sort of conquest in and of itself. They had different ones. Asia had many different advanced civilizations. Europe had very well established powers, and the Americas had developing civilizations. So all of these conquests, whenever we think of the conquisition of a land, of a people, of a country, we're basically saying that there's a clash of worlds coming together, right? Cultural, religious, spiritual, traditional, right? All of these things kind of come together, and they're just kind of pushed towards each other, right? There's these two different things coming together, and it's like, okay, who's gonna win? This side or this side. So we're going to look at these global encounters in Asia, Europe, and the Americas, and see how they ended up after. In Matthew 24:14, it says that the gospel of the kingdom of Adonai will be preached throughout the whole world. So the conquests, in a way, were for Adonai to make himself known. And if this wouldn't have existed, if history wouldn't have unfolded the way it did, a lot of our Jewish brothers would not. It would have been different, basically, right? They would have seen that there was no need for evangelization. They would have already seen themselves as God's people. But Yeshua makes it clear that we need to preach the gospel, right? That the good news of Adonai needs to be shared, right? And so the life, looking at the Torah, looking at things and events that happen in the Bible and how we can compare them to them now, the whole life of Abraham was basically an act of evangelization. And so the Bible says that the gospel of the kingdom must be preached to all nations before the end comes. So the gospel had to reach the ends of the earth. The empires of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas played a huge role in fulfilling that mission. So for specifically looking at, like we said, Asia, Europe, for Asians, the gospel was not necessarily the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, but it was the same principle. It was spreading God's message, right? It was in these times of war, famine, death, that Adonai's word was still prevailing. There was still a way of it to be spread, right? Even amidst all these things that were not as good. And so if we look at the year 1492, we see the rule of the Catholic monarchs and how here Spain dominated much of Europe politically, and we can say also religious. So through this, the Catholic Church had adopted certain traditions like the Rosary. And as Spain started to expand, it conquered people's different elements, and it created itself in that culture. So the Spanish Reconquista had paved the way for a later conquest that occurred in the Americas. So I remember that in this time period, there was no Reformation yet. Calvin had not been born. So here, in this context, the main religion was Catholicism. So when we understand that, we're able to see the context of the European conquest of this new world. So after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, the Jews were dispersed all throughout Europe. So the Judaism, though, that had been spread throughout was not the same of the Second Temple period, but it still held the Torah and its traditions. So at this point, Islam had not appeared yet. This would happen later. So with Islam was from a man named Muhammad, and he was born in Mecca in 570 CE. His father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6. So the people that raised him was his grandfather and his uncle. So at the age of 40, he was meditating at the cave of Hira, and he received his first revelation from the archangel Gabriel, saying, "Recite in the name of your Lord," which is Quran 96:1. So Muhammad preached about one God and social justice, but his message had threatened the local leaders' power and wealth. And so in this, there was a leading of persecution that began. In 622 CE, him and his followers fled to Medina. This event was called the Hijra and made the start of the Islamic calendar. It was here that Muhammad founded a religious and political community where Muslims, Jews, and Arabs coexisted under shared laws. He later died in 632 CE, and he left behind the Quran and the Hadith, which is still used to guide the Islam faith today. So after this, we see the rise of an empire called the Ottoman Empire, and this was under the leadership of Osman I in the 8th century. This grew rapidly through the Islam expansion, and it was governed under the Sharia law. Just like many other empires, the Ottomans allowed multiple religions to coexist altogether, and this system was called the Millet. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II, he conquered Constantinople, which had been conquered before by Constantine. So this man, Mehmed, he conquered Constantinople and he renamed it to Istanbul. Istanbul was made the Islamic center of Europe. So there was leaders like Suleiman and Suleiman, the Magnificent, leaders like him that expanded the empire into Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. After this, like everything, There was corruption, inefficiency, and military losses that led to the weakening of this empire. And after they entered into the World War II with Germany, they lost, and so this empire was dismantled. In 1922, the last sultan was deposed, and the Republic of Turkey was created under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So the Ottoman Empire left a lasting mark on religion, politics, and even culture. There was its rise that was inspired by faith, and the fall reminds us that even the greatest empires fade away. So, what does this have to do with what we're talking about, right? This shows how evangelization is spread even through conquest, through persecution, and it shows that all these three things, that faith, politics, and expansion, are all merged together really into one. They all have to do with each other. In this next part, we're going to focus on the Jewish exile of 1492. And so there was the arrival of the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, and that became with the Diaspora. And this had always been a sort of part of the Jewish culture, right? Because there was wars, expulsions, persecutions, the Jewish people had to move and seek safety somewhere else. They were fleeing somewhere else, right? Like we've mentioned before, the destruction of the Second Temple marks a specific time period, right? We're always mentioning the Judaism of the Second Temple, the destruction of the Second Temple. This is a very important event in history, right? So this event was a major turning point, and that caused the Jews to be spread out all throughout the Roman Empire. And so even though they lived throughout different cultures, they still kept their faith and traditions. So it was throughout the Middle Ages that Jews were allowed to continue practicing their religion, but they had to pay taxes. And as the Catholic evangelization grew stronger, there was these tensions that began to occur between them. And this led to the Jewish exile from Spain. So when we are focusing on the Jewish community, there was always a structured life called the Juderias. And most Jews were artisans, right? They were merchants. They lived a simple life. So there were some that were wealthy. And even as Catholicism grew, there were tensions between the two social groups, the Francos, who were tax exempt, and the Pecheros, who had to pay. In 1391, there were many wealthy Jews that converted to Christianity, which had caused resentment among both remaining Jews and Catholics. So in the 15th century, there was suspicion that grew that converted the Jews and that they were secretly practicing Judaism. This later on caused there to be violence and persecution. And the Catholic monarchs, in their idea to create religious unity, they established and created the Spanish Inquisition in 1478. And this was led by Tomás de Torquemada. And the whole purpose of this Spanish Inquisition was to strengthen the Catholics, to remove threats, the Jews, and to seize property from the accused Jews. So in 1492, we see the Catholic monarchs, and they issue something called the Edict of Granada. And this ordered all the Jews in Castile and Aragon to either convert or to leave. So this is persecution. They're being persecuted, right? And if they decided to stay, they had to follow Catholicism strictly. Those who decided to leave, they could take their things, but they could not take the gold, silver, or horses, which is what later on founded the monarchy, the Catholic monarchy. It's as a result of this that the Jews dispersed to North Africa, Portugal, parts of Europe, and even Italy. The descendants of them are now called the Sephardim, which is the Sepharad, and which is the Hebrew name for Spain. Crazy stuff that's happening here that happened in Spain with the Inquisition. So when we were talking earlier about the Ottoman Empire, we see the parts of Asia, the uprising of other religions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, and animism, and this remained dominant, and they were resistant to evangelization. So, not forgetting not only the Spanish and Europe, but also these different Asian countries and what's happening at that point as well. So Genghis Khan, which you've probably heard of, he was born Temujin in 1162 and he died in 1227. He united the Mongol tribes and created the largest continuous empire in history. He was orphaned, he was poor, and he became powerful in the year 1206. And he led disciplined armies that conquered China, Central Asia, Persia, and even parts of Europe. He promoted the trade of Silk Road. He enforced laws and supported religious tolerance among the Christians, Muslims, and even the Buddhists. His faith, which is called Tengriism, was shamanistic, and under his rule, there were many religious ideas that spread across Asia. So we can't forget Asia. We can't forget what was happening there and the conquests that were happening with the people there. So looking at the Silk Road and what that was, the Silk Road was essential for trade. This allowed things to get exchanged between each other, things like silk, spices, porcelain, metals, and even new technologies were moved into Europe, Asia, and Asia. So this kind of trade, they helped the Europeans, helped them with their growth and their cultural development. And it was through Catholicism and Islam, even though they were not strong in Mongolia. Now China has one of the largest Protestant Christian populations in the world. And it shows how powerful evangelization is, right? And how it has reached even the farthest lands in the span of this time, right? So that was Asia. If we're coming back to Jewish history, we see the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. We see the Jews spread widely, but they kept their identity intact. It was in Spain under Byzantine and Arab rule. They experienced something called the Golden Age, and this was a thrive in scholarship, philosophy, and even trade. So it was a very good time to be alive. Later, we see the Crusades. We see the Jewish people that suffered persecution. They were restricted to very, very specific jobs, such as money lending. They faced expulsions and culminated in their exile from Spain in 1492 and in Portugal in 1497. So the Jews also played a very big role in the conquest of the Americas. So when Columbus sailed to Spain in August 3, 1942, so they arrived in the New World on October 12th, this was the same year as the Jewish expulsion, and many Jews and converts, they were a part of the voyage. So Columbus's expedition was funded greatly by Jewish financiers and people like Luis de Santangel and Abraham Sacuto. And these Jewish navigators and interpreters, people like Rodrigo de Triana, Maestre Bernal, Luis de Torres, had also participated. So the Spanish conquest included many encounters with great civilizations such as the Aztecs, the Incas, and others in the Caribbean and Mesoamerica. Many of these Jews converted other Jews, and they established colonies in places beyond the reach of the Inquisition. So by the late 1500s, the Jewish communities had formed in Brazil, Jamaica, Barbados, Mexico, and Cuba. So these contributions had financial backing, expertise in navigation and astronomy, and cultural diversity. So even under this persecution, they built lasting communities and influenced the regional development. So this shows their resilience, adaptability, and lasting impact. This teaching encourages us to view the conquest from a faith-based perspective, not just seeing, oh, this is bad, this is good, right? But really understanding the role that the Jewish people had, and understanding that through this Catholic conquest, even though it was violent and complex, it paved the way later for evangelization and the spread of truth. So the Jewish background, the story of the Marranos, which were the converted Jews, and their financial and cultural influence in the conquest of the Americas are a huge part of history, not something that's really taught or explained, but it's something that we can overlook sometimes. And so looking at faith, cultural, and historical understanding, we really get the whole picture of the purpose and how these human events came together to form the history, which has greatly impacted us. So let's continue on, answer our questions, and I'll see you in the next class. Shalom.